Well, look, we will have some more join, but let's kick things off. So welcome, everybody. My name is Michaela Costello, and I'm pleased to host today's EOA Experts Panel Webinar. To start, it's my pleasure to acknowledge the country upon which we are joining this webinar today and to pay my respects to the elders of this land. I'm speaking to you all today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. In our third session today of the experts panel, I am pleased to welcome Professor Andrew Pendleton from the University of New South Wales, where he's currently the Professor of Employee Ownership and Reward in the School of Management and Governance. Andrew is very well versed in this field, having researched employee ownership and employee share ownership for many years, and has been an active contributor to policy discussions on employee ownership in the UK, Australia, and the AU. And today we are very pleased that Andrew is joining us, and he's going to outline for us the main features of employee ownership trust and explain why this is such an attractive form of business succession, especially in today's environment. We are also joined by another Andrew Clements, who is the chair of EOA and currently a legal consultant in the Melbourne office of King, Wood and Mallisons. And so Andrew is here, the other Andrew is here to support today for any of the technical questions that come through. So in terms of today, Andrew is P. I'm going to have to start using initials. Andrew P will take us through the slides, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end of the slide deck. So please feel free to put your questions into the chat box, and we will hold those to the end from that perspective. So without further ado, I will hand over to you now, Andrew Pendleton. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela, and good morning, colleagues, and good evening if any friends and colleagues are joining in from the UK, where it's currently midnight. I'm going to talk today about employee ownership trusts in the UK, and I'm going to be reporting on some work that I've done with a colleague at the University of Leeds, Andrew Robinson, and supported by Jessica Eustantier at UNSW. I'd also like to acknowledge Graham Nuttall, who, as some of you will know, plays a starring role in the EOT story and did an EOA seminar 2 or 3 months ago. And also to Nigel Mason, who sadly passed away last year, but was a leading supporter of EOTs and played a pivotal role in developing research in this area. So next slide, please, Max. So one of the reasons we're talking about employee ownership trusts is they've been a phenomenal success story. On the slide here, we present a graph of the number of new EOTs up until about mid-2021. And as you can see, it's a pretty steep exponential rise in the number of EOT firms. Since that graph was done, there's been another very significant expansion in numbers. We're currently computing the numbers for hopefully the end of June to find out the current position, but it's somewhere between 800 and 1,000 EOTs in the UK now, and we think closer to 1,000. So it's really been a very impressive growth trajectory indeed. And the appeal of EOTs is starting to spread far and wide. We now have an EOT in Australia in the form of MELD, with several more in the pipeline. Elsewhere in Canada, the government is intending to legislate to create something like an EOT structure. So it's a very impressive story so far. Let me now tell you a little bit more about the genesis and the features of the Employee Ownership Trust. So EOTs were created in 2014 in the UK, arising out of a review of employee ownership conducted by Graham Nuttall, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. Essentially, the EOT is a very simple structure conceptually, and simply involves majority ownership of a company passing from an exiting owner to a trust which collectively holds ownership for the benefit of all employees. Employees therefore become indirect owners of their employer. And this was based on the long-standing John Lewis and Arup models. Some of you may know that John Lewis is a leading department store in the UK, similar to David Jones, I guess. John Lewis has been employee owned with a trust owning the company on behalf of the employees, past, current and future, for well over half a century. Now, the appeal and a large part of the explanation for the rapid growth of the EOT form is that it's a highly effective and flexible exit route for business owners wanting to exit their ownership without the company passing to a third party, with all the dangers that might present to the company that the owner has built up, often over many years. Next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit more about the tax position as it relates to the EOT in the UK. So to reiterate, the EOT involves majority ownership of the ordinary shares of a trading company, passing to an EOT trust which collectively holds ownership for the benefit of all employees. So all employees are required to be eligible, except those that are new employees and those that are 5% plus shareholders. Now, the tax benefit for the exiting owner is that he or she receives a capital gains tax exemption when ownership passes to the trust. I won't go into the details of CGT in the UK, but the key point is that the owner is exempt from CGT if ownership passes to an EOT. At the same time, if there's any element of gift in the transaction, this doesn't count towards inheritance tax thresholds for either the vendor or the beneficiaries. And then having established an EOT, employees are able to receive annual bonuses up to £3,600 UK free of income tax, as long as this profit share is passed to employees on equal terms, either equally according to pay, hours worked, or tenure. This particular provision dealt with an anomaly in the UK whereby all firms other than those with indirect ownership of this sort could operate share schemes that could allocate up to £3,600 worth of shares to employees. So this sort of introduced a form of profit share for companies that are collectively owned indirectly by their employees. Next slide, please. Max, thank you. So the EOT is essentially a special form of employee benefit trust. And in principle, in any jurisdiction where there is an employee trust framework, could in effect create an EOT type structure. The EOT is usually established as a trust company, and it's common for companies to create a new holding company, which the EOT becomes the owner. After the tax year in which the owner receives a CGT relief, the EOT assumes the tax liability for CGT and would pay CGT should there be a disqualifying event, such as the sale of the company. It's generally recommended that the employee ownership trust itself should take a paritarian form. That is, it's composed of both the owner and employee interests, so that the interests of both are protected. And we'll see that that's important, particularly for the owner, given the nature of the sale process, which I'll be coming on to in just a few minutes. So in the next slide, I'll try and show diagrammatically how the EOT structure works. Now, if you look in the middle of the slide, essentially the owner is passing shares to an employee ownership trust for which they receive payment. Now, how does the employee trust acquire the resources to pay for these shares? Well, they could take out a bank loan for which they would need to repay over a period of years using profits from the company. However, that is not the most common way that EOT transactions happen. Typically, the owner will strike an arrangement with the trust whereby they'll receive deferred consideration for their ownership over a period of years. So in a sense, the owner is essentially lending the trust the financial resources which the trust can then use to acquire the shares from the owner. Meanwhile, the company will pass profits to the employee trust, which will then be used to repay either the bank, if used, or the owner. And at the same time, the company may take advantage of the tax-free legislation to make an annual profit share to the employees. So it's a relatively simple structure, and it operates in a way that makes the transition to employee ownership relatively painless for all parties. And in subsequent slides, I'll attempt to show how this works in more detail. But moving on to the next slide, employee ownership trusts are similar to US ESOPs in the way that the trust acquires shares from the exiting owner, but there's one very large difference, and that is the EOT does not distribute shares from the trust to individuals. So it as it were a bit like an ESOP, apart from the final stage. The shares remain in trust for the benefit of individuals, but the employees do not individually acquire shares. Now, this helps to contribute to the simplicity of the EOT structure, because it means that EOTs are much less complex administratively than ESOPs. There's no need for the company to maintain individual beneficiary or share accounts. And because no shares go to individuals, there's no requirement for the trust to repurchase shares from departing employees. On the downside, the EOT doesn't give the full benefits of direct ownership in the sense of an employee having a share certificate in their back pocket. But nevertheless, the tax efficient annual bonus means that the employee can get a financial payoff. However, should an EOT company want to allocate shares to individuals, it can in principle do so, though not from the EOT. It could, if the EOT is not 100% owner, it is feasible in principle for the company to also operate a tax-approved employee share scheme, which would allocate shares to individuals. And there are some companies with EOTs that do this. But the key point I want to get over here is the administrative simplicity of EOTs compared to other forms of employee ownership. And to my mind, this explains a considerable degree of the EOT success. So I hope I've given so far a fairly straightforward explanation of what the EOT looks like. To recap, it's simply the passage of shares in the company from an exiting owner to an employee trust, which holds shares on behalf of the employees. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is give you some further details of how EOTs operate in the UK. And I'm going to be drawing on a survey that Andrew Robinson and myself conducted in 2020 going into 2021 of all companies with an EOT. We've got 210 companies responding to the survey, which is about 25% or so of current EOTs, but rather more when the survey was conducted. As you can see, EOTs come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. The average size of an EOT is 120 employees, but the median is somewhat lower than that, showing that most EOTs incline towards the smaller end of the distribution. But having said that, there are some very large companies with EOTs, with the largest in our survey having 4,500 employees. Although EOTs on the whole tend to be smaller companies, they tend not to be the very smallest companies, because there are requirements in the legislation that any remaining large shareholders shouldn't be more than 40% of the employees of the company. It tends to inhibit EOTs being in companies with less than 5 employees. There are some that have less than 5, and the lowest in our survey is 3, but they tend to be companies with, on the whole, with more than 5 employees, but less than 100 or so. A similar story with turnover. The average turnover is 39 million, but the median is a lot lower than that. But equally, once again, to reiterate, there are some very large companies with EOTs, with the highest turnover in our survey of 3 billion. I should say at this point that EOTs are nearly always very healthy companies with good levels of profitability. It's very rare indeed for an EOT to be formed in a failing company. There's all sorts of reasons why that's the case, which I can elaborate on in the chat if anybody's interested. But it's essentially a structure that is associated with healthy companies. Next slide, please. So the legislation requires that 50% of the company be passed to the EOT. In practice, the levels of employee ownership tends to be much higher than this. In fact, in 3/4 of cases, owners sell out entirely, so the EOT owns 100% of the company. And we'll see here on the slide that the median ownership is 100%, though the average is a little bit less than that. Even where the EOT doesn't own 100%, nearly all of the ownership of nearly all EOTs is nevertheless owned by insiders to the company, be it the departing owner retaining a share, directors having a share, or indeed employees having some direct employee share ownership in addition to the EOT ownership. But essentially the picture is very high levels of ownership by the employee ownership trust. Next slide, please. And here this provides a little bit more detail in this. So in a 1/4 of cases, the previous owner retains some ownership in the company, and that in our survey ranges from 2% right through to 49%. Now this is a further example of the flexibility of the EOT form, in that the departing owner doesn't necessarily have to fully depart Some owners want to stage their exit from ownership, and the EOT structure enables them to do this in stark contrast to, for instance, a trade sale, where normally, in most cases, the owner would depart completely. We also see here that in about just under 20% of cases, directors and senior managers have some ownership, and in 8% employees have some direct ownership. But in only 3% of cases are external investors involved. Next slide, please. So in the survey, we asked our respondents why the company became employee-owned and adopted an EOT. The strongest reason was to provide long-term stability for the company, to preserve and develop the company as the owner had developed it, without the threat of dismemberment that sometimes arises, for instance, in sale to a third party. Also important to share rewards with employees. A little bit less important, the tax benefits. A little bit less important still that it was seen as a socially responsible thing to do. And then a little bit less important again to keep the company and the jobs local. But perhaps the most striking finding here is that forming an EOT wasn't a desperate measure where an owner couldn't sell their company. This was the least important reason for forming an EOT, that the owner couldn't find an alternative buyer. So the EOT, offers some very positive reasons for a departing owner, and that's reflected in our findings here. So moving on to the next slide, connected to this, we asked whether owners did consider an alternative to employee ownership, and perhaps unsurprisingly, in a large percentage of cases, a trade sale was considered. Management buyouts considered in about half of those cases, and then about 20% considered sale to private equity. Just over 10% considered closing down the company, and 1% considered breaking up the company. But in nearly a quarter of cases, employee ownership was the only alternative considered. So, yeah, let's move on to the next slide, please. So I referred earlier to how the transaction is financed, and here we're presenting some further details on that. So we can see here that in 86% of cases, the transaction was financed by the vendor taking deferred payment, typically over a 6-7 year period. So rather than the resources having to be found on, as it were, day zero to resource the transaction, the company pays for the transaction over a period of years. In only just over 10% of cases did the EOT use external bank finance to resource the transaction. And then in a tiny number of cases was private equity involved, or employee contributions. There are now some specialist finance houses in the UK which do support employee ownership, and they're captured in that figure for private equity. In just under 60% of cases, the company was sold at fair market value, and around a third was sold at a discount, or indeed completely given away in a small number of cases. With the discount on fair market value ranging from anything from 5 to 75%. The 75% would be large there. I should say on the process that the typical way of working the transaction would be that the owner would seek a valuation, and also the trust would seek an independent valuation, and the sale price would be arise from that process. Now, one thing that I haven't said, but I should emphasize, is that in moving to an EOT structure, the departing owner is very much setting up the transaction and the timescale on their terms. So the owner typically would initiate the formation of the trust, and the owner and their advisors would then be negotiating with the trust and their advisors, but without the uncertainty that you would have where you're putting your company for sale on the open market, and all the uncertainties and unpredicted outcomes that might arise from this. So it's a much more sort of controlled process from the departing owner's perspective, and this obviously offers a lot of advantages to the departing owner, whilst at the same time there are safeguards for employees' interests in the process. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So, as I mentioned a few moments ago, in the vast majority of cases, the owner takes deferred consideration from the employee ownership trust to facilitate the process. In effect, the owner is loaning to the employee ownership trust. So we wanted to ask about the loan repayment process, and the obvious issue here is that the requirement for the company to make these payments via the trust over a period of years could constrain the company and its investment over the coming years. So we asked whether the debt incurred in forming the EOT has constrained the company, and we can see here that 2/3 nearly say not at all, with just over a quarter saying a little, but very few finding the financing arrangements a severe constraint on the company. In our survey, nearly 10% had repaid in full, with the typical repayment from the point at which the survey was done being 6.5 years. And on average, around 30% of annual profits used for repaying the owner and the loan. Let me now give you some examples of EOTs, if we could go on to the next slide. I should say that these companies are not in the survey. This information is taken from the web, so it's publicly available information. First example is a company called Richer Sounds, which is a hi-fi retailer with just over 50 stores. I tend to think of this as a bit like JB Hi-Fi, but its product range is much smaller than JB Hi-Fi, but it's a similar kind of operation. And here the founder, Julian Richer, wanted to pass the company to employee ownership, but didn't want to sort of take a cliff edge approach to exiting. That he wanted to retain some ownership for the time being before exiting completely. So he passed 60% of the company to an EOT 3 years ago and retained 40%. Since becoming employee owned, the company's established a colleague forum and have adopted various positive employment practices, such as the paying the real living wage and having a policy of no 0 hours, which is unusual in the retail sector in the UK these days. Note that Richer Sounds is not a small company. It's got over 500 employees and a £200 million turnover. So echo my previous point that there are some large companies doing the EOT form. Next slide, please. Another company, which is a relatively recent convert to an EOT, is a company called Go Ape, which operates treetop adventure sites in the UK and the USA. Once again, large companies, got around 1,000 employees, though smaller turnover than Richer Sounds. Here again, this provides an example that the EOT enables a gradual exit by the owner, should they want to do that. So the owners passed 90% to the EOT last year, but retained 10% to maintain some involvement in the company, but not control. They've been looking to exit for quite a while and had explored selling to external investors, but their big fear was that an external purchaser would cherry pick the key sites, break the business up, sell some bits on and so on, and they didn't want that to happen. So the Employee Ownership Trust provided a means for them to exit, but not completely, and to maintain the company in its current form. And one thing that happened after the Employee Ownership Trust was created was that the company formed an employee council. And then next slide, please, Max, for the final company. This is an architecture practice based in Northern Ireland, the first EOT in Northern Ireland, called White Ink, which is somewhat smaller than the other companies I've shown. But I use this one because the EOT structure is now very widespread in architecture in the UK. And I can perhaps say more about that in the questions if anybody's interested. The owners have not yet exited. They continue to run the business, but they've started the process for their eventual exit by passing a majority of their ownership to an employee ownership trust. Next slide, please. So I'm conscious of time. I'll try and speed up a bit. Just wanted to show you that employees get something out of this financially. So just under 60% had given a profit share in the last year, and a further 77% were about to give one. The average profit share was £2,800, sort of 5,000 Australian dollars or thereabouts. With the profit share, just over half cases done equally, but done according to pay, hours or tenure in others. Next slide, please. Talking about employee involvement in control, our EOTs had instituted a number of new forms of employee governance. Worker directors in just over a third of cases, an employee council in just under a fifth of cases, regular employee shareholder meetings in just under a third of cases, and employee trustees in around 4/5 of cases. Now, one of the things about EOTs and governance is that the company doesn't necessarily need to create these new forms of governance at the point of the transaction. And in many cases, these forms of governance emerge after the transaction has actually occurred. So there's a great degree of flexibility as to how the employee role in governing the company is developed after the EOT is created. Next slide, please. So here is some information on the composition of the EOT itself. And the point that I'd want to make here is that the EOT typically balances a variety of interests within the company, be it senior managers, exiting owners, or employees. There's also independent trustees present in about 2/3 of cases. One thing that's quite interesting is that in just a small percentage of cases is an offshore trust company used. Now, there's a degree of controversy here because if the trust is operated offshore, the trust is not necessarily liable to CGT should the company subsequently be sold. And there has been some anxiety in some quarters that some owners may be wanting to simply sell the company, but not to their employees by using an offshore trust company arrangement, enabling the company to be quickly sold on after the EOT has been created. In practice, this does not seem to be an issue. Graham Nuttall's been doing some work on this, and it seems that most companies that have used an offshore trust have done so because their professional advisors have typically used offshore trusts for various transactions. Next slide, please. I put this slide in because it gives some details on the sectoral distribution of EOTs. Approximately 40% are in professional services, such as architecture. There's a number of legal firms that are now have EOTs in the UK. They're followed by construction, which might seem a little bit surprising, but many of the firms in this category are building engineering companies, specialist construction firms, and so on. Then followed by wholesale and retail, then manufacturing, and then information and communications. Next slide, please. So this is, I guess, the crux of the issue. Why has the EOT form been so successful in the UK? And it's essentially because it provides a very effective and flexible solution to business succession. It maintains company independence. It has a degree of certainty of sale and price, with the negotiation process for the transaction becoming much more controlled and predictable. It enables the owner to exit very much on their terms, and in particular enables a phased exit to occur, rather than a sort of cliff edge exit should a third party acquire the firm. Although employees come to be beneficial owners, EOT firms typically maintain conventional management structures, but nevertheless it provides a vehicle for greater employee engagement and involvement. Obviously, in the UK case, there are tax advantages to forming an EOT, but I would also emphasize that essentially it's conceptually a fairly simple process. The EOT also provides a very effective solution to the obstacles that are typically found to moving to employee ownership. If you'd wanted to move to employee ownership and you needed employees to contribute to achieve the transaction, you've got a major collective action problem. Do all employees want to do it? How do you coordinate them? Can employees afford to do it? Do employees want to bear additional risk? Are financial institutions going to help employees do this? The EOT, as it were, completely resolves these problems that can arise with the transition to employee ownership. So it's a very effective and flexible solution from a business owner point of view, and it's a very effective mechanism for bringing about employee ownership. Next slide, please. So this, I think, explains the very dramatic growth in EOTs in the UK. It's potentially very attractive to owners. It's flexible, it's simple. And we've now got to a stage where there's a very strong imitation effect going on, that the business press in various sectors are picking up on key firms in that sector that have moved to an EOT, and this gets picked up by other firms where the owner is thinking of exiting. So we've now got to a situation in the UK of self-sustaining growth. There's a very strong sort of ecosystem of EOT firms. Take architecture, for instance. Over 100 architect firms are now employee owned, most of them with an EOT structure. And of course, because this has now become so widespread, and because of the tax breaks involved, the EOT model is one that professional advisors can't ignore. If an advisor didn't mention this to a business owner who wanted to exit, they'd probably be a bit negligent. So to conclude, onto the final slide, please. I'm sorry for going on a little bit much. It's a very simple, flexible structure that sidesteps many of the issues that arises in business exits and employee ownership concept conversions. And the EOT, it looks like, it's here to stay. Now, moving elsewhere, the EOT concept, if not necessarily the specific UK regulatory features, can be used elsewhere, even where the specific regulatory framework is not present. And that's something that the EOA here in Australia is actively working on at present. So I hope I haven't gone on too long. I am conscious that I've spoken a bit longer than I meant to, but I hope the information has been interesting, and thank you very much for listening.
Perfect. So we have had some questions come through, Andrew, so I'll feed them through to you. The first one is, trusts are generally a structure outside legislation. Why does Canada legislation need this legislative support? Why can't it just go ahead and create EOTs now?
As I understand it, Canada is perhaps a rather unusual jurisdiction in that it doesn't have an existing employee benefit structure or concept. So as I understand it, the Canadian government is going to have to legislate to create the concept.
Perfect. Then the next one, and I know you spoke, so you may be able to give us some more detail, but we have Jessica Mitchell, who's curious about the type of firms that make up the 800 to 1,000 EOTs in the UK. I work for a law firm that is now EOT owned. Are there many other UK firms that are EOT owned, and are there any in Australia or elsewhere? And I know your slide had, 40% were professional services. So I don't know if you've got a further breakdown in terms of the law firm side of that.
I don't, I'm afraid. There are a number, and I don't know which firm the questioner works for, but perhaps just draw attention to RM2 Partnership, which is a legal firm which actually works on employee share ownership and employee ownership, was owned by Nigel Mason, who I mentioned right at the beginning. That transition to employee ownership must be about 18 months ago. In total, off the top of my head, there's somewhere between 5 and 10 legal firms that are employee owned with an EOT in the UK at present.
Perfect. So the next question, and Jessica, is from Tapestry Compliance. How
right.
can the UK success in this area be pushed forward in Australia?
Okay, I did wonder whether the questioner was from Tapestry, and I nearly sort of mentioned Tapestry, but thought I wouldn't. I think perhaps, does Andrew want to come in there? Andrew C.
Yeah, I mean, happy to. And I think the answer is, and with my EOA hat on, there's been huge interest in the structure. And this also, in a sense, almost goes back to the question about legislative support for the structure. We've advanced a long way without any particular forms of, if I can call it, legislative facilitation. But what we do find is at the edges, and to generate the maximum flexibility that Andrew P's talked about today, we bump into some generally tax issues, which then constrain the way that we take an EOT forward. So from an EOA perspective, we want this to be a widely adapted form of business ownership in Australia. And to do that, we need maximum flexibility. And to get that maximum flexibility, we'll need to work with both the ATO and government to deal with some of the constraints on flexibility.
Thank you. Then I'm just very conscious of time, and we have got a couple more here. So what we might need to do is to take some of these offline. So Anonymous put through a question that we haven't got to yet. So perhaps if you wouldn't mind giving your name, I can get someone to respond after the session. But Patrick Fincham has just put in a comment, very interesting presentation. I'm in a firm that has many of these EOT characteristics. Couple of observations. I was a previous owner and agreed to deferred payment for my original holding, but me and my fellow previous owners had to ride some bumps and agreed to foregoing dividends on our shares and delays to repayment, so trust and flexibility was required. We've established a board elected by the employee trustees to run the company on our behalf. So we've something in action already. And then finally, just to throw hopefully a quick one from Max Ogden, were unions present in any of the companies, and did they play a positive or negative role?
The answer to that is no. That I think in only 1% of cases were unions involved. And that reflects the fact that there is very little union presence in smaller firms in the UK private sector these days. I don't think the EOT structure poses threats to unions, and unions are on the whole not opposed to EOTs, but it's just the type of firms that have done EOTs have not been unionized.
Perfect. Well, look, on that note, I will close things. So I've just sent a message to the person with the question we didn't get to. So if you could send through your details, we'll make sure we respond. But look, Andrew, I want to just thank you very much for a very informative session today. I think it nicely ties out some of the conversations and sessions we've previously had on employee ownership trust. And definitely the UK is absolutely leading the way on this front. So just want to thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated. To all of our listeners, thank you for joining us. And we'll come to you in July with our next EOA Experts webinar. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.